On the 23rd day of September, in the year 63 BC, a child was born in the city of Rome. His name was Gaius Octavius. Few took note of the infant's arrival, for he came not from Rome's greatest houses of power, nor from its long line of celebrated generals. Yet, destiny had quietly entered the world that day. This boy would grow to outlast them all. He would navigate civil wars, betrayals, and bloodshed. He would stand above the ruins of the Republic, not merely as a survivor, but as the architect of something new, the Roman Empire. How does a boy of modest birth, a sickly child overshadowed by greater men, come to rule the known world? To understand Augustus, the man who would be Rome's first emperor, we must begin with his family and the Rome into which he was born. Octavius's father, also named Gaius Octavius, was not of the senatorial elite. He belonged to the equestrian class, the Roman social rank beneath the Senate. In Rome's rigid hierarchy, this was a man climbing upward. His achievements mattered, for he was what Romans called a novus homo, a new man. This term described someone who was the first in his family to rise into political prominence. For centuries, Rome had been dominated by ancient aristocratic lineages, but occasionally, through talent, a man like Octavius the Elder could push through the barriers of tradition. He had served with distinction, even reaching the governorship of Macedonia. His reputation was solid, though not dazzling. Yet his marriage had bound him to something greater. His wife, Balba, was the niece of none other than Julius Caesar. Through her, the young Octavius was tied by blood to the most ambitious man in Rome. Names carried weight in Roman society. A boy inherited his father's praenomen, personal name, and nomen, clan name. Thus, our subject was called Gaius Octavius, belonging to the gens Octavia. But names could change, and with them a man's fate. This child, born Gaius Octavius, would one day be called Augustus, a name meaning the revered one. That transformation lay far in the future. Tragedy came early. In 59 BC, when Octavius was only 4 years old, his father died suddenly while returning from service abroad. His mother soon remarried, wedding Lucius Marcius Philippus, a man of influence. Yet Philippus showed little affection for his stepson. The boy's real guidance came from his grandmother, Julia, the sister of Julius Caesar. Julia raised him with stern Roman values, discipline, dignity, and ambition. She was the bridge to Caesar's powerful world, and her presence shaped the boy's understanding of family honor. At just 12 years old, Octavius delivered the funeral oration at her death. Standing before Rome's citizens, his small figure and youthful voice carried with them an unusual gravity. Those who heard him noted the poise of the child. It was a moment that revealed early signs of ambition. The city had witnessed a boy who carried himself like a man far beyond his years. Behind the frail body, often troubled by illness, there lived a mind sharp and calculating. Octavius grew into a youth marked by quiet determination. He studied rhetoric and religion. He knew the importance of appearances in Rome, and already, he seemed to prepare himself for a future most would never have imagined for him. To understand the path before Octavius, one must see Rome as it stood in those years. By the middle of the 1st century BC, Rome was unmatched in power. Her armies had conquered the Mediterranean, her fleets ruled the seas, her wealth flowed from Spain to Syria. Yet this very success bred instability. Rome had grown too quickly, and her old republican system, designed for a city-state, struggled to govern an empire. Ambitious generals clashed for supremacy. Politicians bought loyalty with coin rather than honor. The Senate, once the heart of Roman authority, was divided by corruption and fear. Civil war had already scarred Rome. The rivalry of Marius and Sulla had torn the Republic apart decades earlier. Sulla, in his march upon Rome, had shown that armies could no longer be bound by law. They followed their generals, not the Senate. His dictatorship left deep wounds, teaching Romans that political power could be seized by force. Then came the rise of the first triumvirate. 3 men bound themselves together. Pompey the Great, the most celebrated general of his age, Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and Julius Caesar, the ambitious commander seeking glory in Gaul. Their alliance was uneasy, but it reshaped Roman politics. Caesar, through his conquest of Gaul, became the most feared man in Rome. His victories made him a hero to the people, but a threat to the Senate. When ordered to lay down his command, Caesar chose instead to march. In 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon River with his legion, defying the Republic. It was an act of war. Pompey, once his ally, became his enemy. Their struggle ended in disaster for Pompey, who fled to Egypt and was murdered there. Caesar returned to Rome as its master, holding the title of dictator. This word, in Roman tradition, had once meant a temporary office held in times of crisis. But Caesar's dictatorship carried a different weight. He ruled as one who intended to reform the republic entirely, some said, even to make himself king. For Romans, the very word rex, king, was anathema, a reminder of tyranny long overthrown. The Senate watched with suspicion. Caesar reshaped laws, redistributed land, and extended citizenship. Many hailed him as a savior. Others whispered of monarchy. In this volatile world, Octavius was coming of age. As a teenager, Octavian sought a role within this vast and dangerous stage. He was given early religious duties, entering into priesthoods that carried prestige. He studied and learned the ways of power, yet he longed for military service, to prove himself as a commander. In 46 BC, he accompanied Caesar to Hispania during the campaign against Pompey's surviving sons. There, though young and inexperienced, he showed a willingness to endure hardship, impressing the great general. Caesar saw in him potential, though the boy was still but a youth. And then a decision was made that would alter the course of history. In his will, Julius Caesar adopted Octavian as his son and heir. It was a staggering elevation. This boy of the equestrian class, frail and largely unknown, was to inherit the name and fortune of Rome's most powerful man. But fate moved swiftly. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, Julius Caesar was struck down by knives in the Senate chamber. The conspirators, men who claimed to be restoring the Republic, had unleashed chaos. In that moment, Octavian was 18 years old. He was away from Rome, but the news reached him with the force of thunder. Caesar was dead. His adoptive son was now his heir. The Republic trembled on the brink of yet another civil war. Octavian set out for Rome. He did not yet know the dangers that awaited him, nor the alliances he would need to forge, nor the blood he would one day spill. But his journey had begun. The boy who had once stood at his grandmother's funeral would now stand at the threshold of history. In the next part, we will follow Octavian's first steps into the brutal arena of Roman politics. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, knives flashed in the Senate House of Rome. Julius Caesar, dictator, conqueror, and master of the Republic, fell beneath the blows of men who had once called him friend. The Ides of March became a date forever burned into memory. Rome, already divided, was thrust into chaos. Far from the capital, in Illyria, a youth only 18 years old received the news. Gaius Octavius, adopted son and heir of Caesar, was struck with shock. The world he had just begun to enter was suddenly torn apart. In Rome, assassins declared themselves liberators, while Caesar's loyalists burned for revenge. The city teetered on the brink of another civil war. How could one so young, inexperienced, and fragile of health hope to claim his inheritance? How could he step into the storm left in Caesar's wake? Few believed it possible. Yet Octavian, calm and determined, began his march into history. When he returned to Rome, Octavian discovered the full magnitude of Caesar's will. He had not merely been remembered as a token heir. Caesar had named him as his son. By adoption, he now bore the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Along with the name came immense wealth, nearly 700 million sesterces, and more importantly, the legitimacy of Caesar's legacy. The Roman people had adored Caesar, despite the fears of the Senate. His veterans, his clients, and the common citizens looked to Octavian as the natural successor. The blood tie through adoption was no small matter in Roman culture. It transformed him instantly from an obscure youth into the visible face of Caesar's cause. But admiration was mixed with doubt. Many whispered that he was too young, too inexperienced, too delicate to lead. Even Caesar's seasoned generals questioned whether this boy could command men hardened by war. Yet Octavian understood something critical. Inheritance was not merely about blood or wealth. It was about perception. If the people believed him Caesar's true heir, power would follow. From the first moment, Octavian acted not as a passive beneficiary, but as a strategist. He presented himself to the people as the son of Caesar, inheritor of his vision. And though skeptics surrounded him, he had already begun to outmaneuver them. But one man stood above the rest as the immediate rival, Mark Antony. He had been Caesar's right hand, his trusted general, and in 44 BC he held the consulship, the highest elected office of the Republic. Antony considered himself the natural heir, not by blood, but by loyalty and proven strength. At Caesar's funeral, Antony seized his moment. His fiery speech before the Roman crowd stirred grief into fury. He unveiled Caesar's bloody toga, pierced with dagger wounds. He read aloud the will, which left gifts to the Roman people. The city erupted in rage. Mobs stormed the houses of the conspirators. Brutus and the others who had slain Caesar fled Rome in fear for their lives. For a time, Antony seemed to control everything. He commanded soldiers. He held office. He carried Caesar's memory. But beneath his triumph lay danger. Antony's ambitions were clear, and many senators, though glad to see the conspirators gone, feared he would take Caesar's place as a new tyrant. Into this volatile arena stepped Octavian. Though Antony regarded him as a child to be brushed aside, Octavian proved far more formidable than expected. Their relationship, uneasy from the beginning, soon hardened into rivalry. They were bound together by Caesar's name, yet divided by their ambitions. Rome was too small for both. Octavian understood that loyalty was bought as much as it was earned. Caesar's vast fortune, now his to wield, became a weapon. With calculated generosity, he distributed gifts, not only fulfilling Caesar's promises to the people, but binding veterans and soldiers to himself. Money flowed into the hands of those who mattered most, the legions. Antony's soldiers began to desert, drawn by Octavian's offers of wealth and Caesar's legacy. Caesar's veterans, settled in colonies across Italy, flocked to him as the rightful heir. With shrewdness beyond his years, Octavian positioned himself as the defender of Caesar's memory, while Antony appeared increasingly self-serving. The Senate, always searching for balance, saw an opportunity. They feared Antony's growing dominance, but here was Octavian, young, ambitious, yet malleable. The Senate began to favor him as a counterweight, thinking they could use Caesar's heir against Antony. In doing so, they underestimated the steel that lay beneath the boy's mild exterior. By 43 BC, Octavian had gathered an army of his own. With veterans at his side and senatorial backing behind him, he was no longer the uncertain youth of Illyria. He was becoming a power in his own right. Events moved swiftly. Octavian marched on Rome with his legions, a bold step that left no doubt of his intentions. The Senate, faced with force, yielded. In an extraordinary moment, the 19-year-old was elected consul of Rome, an office reserved for men of experience, now held by a boy scarcely out of adolescence. It was a shocking rise, but one backed by soldiers and necessity. The stage was now set for a new arrangement of power. On the 27th of November, 43 BC, the Lex Titia was passed. By this law, Rome officially recognized the Second Triumvirate, a political alliance of three men, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus, another of Caesar's loyal commanders. Unlike the informal First Triumvirate of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this was a legal institution, sanctioned by the Senate itself. Together, the three divided Rome's territories among themselves. Antony took the eastern provinces, Lepidus controlled parts of Africa, and Octavian assumed power in the west. Their declared purpose was simple: to avenge the death of Caesar. Yet all Rome knew what lay ahead. To avenge meant blood. Brutus, Cassius, and the assassins had gathered their forces in the east. The triumvirs would march against them. What followed would not be a restoration of the Republic, but its final destruction. The young Octavian had forced his way into Rome's highest office. But to secure his place, he would first have to crush Caesar's killers. In 43 BC, the Republic was formally divided. By the authority of the Lex Titia, three men held supreme power over Rome: Gaius Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus. Together they called themselves the Triumviri Rei Publica Constituent, the triumvirs for the restoration of the state. But Rome's people knew better. This was not restoration. It was domination. The Senate had surrendered its authority. The Republic's old form still stood, but its soul was slipping away. Now, three rulers carved up its provinces as spoils of war, and their first act of unity was vengeance. The assassins of Julius Caesar still lived. Brutus, Cassius, and their allies commanded armies in the east. To avenge the fallen dictator, the triumvirs would first have to cleanse Rome itself, and then march against Caesar's killers in a final reckoning. The answer began with blood. The triumvirs, like Sulla before them, turned to the terrible weapon of proscriptions. By this decree, enemies of the regime were declared outlaws. Their names were posted in public lists. Anyone could kill them without trial. Their property was seized, their families dishonored. The terror swept across Rome. Hundreds fell victim, not only Caesar's assassins, but also senators, equestrians, and wealthy men whose estates could fill the triumvirs' war chests. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. Friends turned on one another. The city shuddered under fear. Among the victims was Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's greatest orator. Once the voice of the Republic, he had opposed Antony bitterly in his speeches, calling for his downfall. For Octavian, Cicero had once been a political ally, praising him as the young hope against Antony. But in the ruthless calculations of survival, Octavian betrayed him. In December of 43 BC, soldiers hunted Cicero as he fled his villa. They caught him and cut him down. His head and hands were displayed in the Forum at Antony's order. Rome's citizens wept, for the voice of their republic was silenced forever. And in that silence, the triumvirs ruled. Octavian, barely 19, showed that he would sacrifice even old allies if power demanded it. Behind his calm exterior, the ruthlessness of a statesman was being forged. With their grip secured in Rome, the triumvirs turned eastward. Brutus and Cassius had not been idle. They commanded the richest provinces of the Mediterranean. Asia, Syria, and Greece poured wealth into their coffers. With that wealth they had raised legions, perhaps 20 in number, and secured fleets to dominate the seas. The assassins called themselves defenders of liberty. They spoke of restoring the Republic, of freeing Rome from tyranny. But their hands were stained with Caesar's blood, and to the veterans who had fought under him, they were traitors. In 42 BC, the triumvirs gathered their might. 28 legions answered their call, with Antony and Octavian sharing command. Lepidus remained behind, his influence already fading. Across the Adriatic Sea, the armies of the triumvirs landed in Greece. It was to be a confrontation on a scale rarely seen in Roman history. Nearly 200,000 men would clash, Romans against Romans, brothers against brothers, in a war to decide not only who ruled, but whether the Republic itself would survive. In October of 42 BC, near the city of Philippi in Macedonia, the armies finally met. Two great battles unfolded on that blood-soaked ground. In the first clash, chaos reigned. Cassius, commander of one wing of the Liberator's army, fought fiercely against Antony. But misfortune struck. Misled by false reports that Brutus had been defeated, Cassius believed the cause lost. Rather than face capture, he fell upon his sword, aided by a loyal freedman. His death was tragic, for in truth, Brutus had held his ground. The war did not end there. Days later, the second battle erupted. Brutus led his forces with courage, but Antony's veterans pressed hard, and Octavian's legions reinforced the attack. Encircled and overwhelmed, Brutus's army broke. His men deserted him, unwilling to fight further. Brutus withdrew, and seeing no path forward, chose death. Surrounded by a few companions, he ran upon his own sword. With his fall, the last hope of the conspirators died. The liberator's cause was crushed. The field of Philippi was thick with the corpses of Romans slain by Romans. Caesar's assassins were no more, and the dream of restoring the Republic perished with them. For Octavian, the victory was life-changing. He had not been the most brilliant commander. Antony had carried much of the burden, but he had been present. His soldiers saw him as Caesar's rightful heir, and in the smoke of Philippi his authority grew. With the liberators destroyed, the triumvirs divided the spoils. Lepidus, increasingly sidelined, was granted Africa, a distant and secondary province. Real power now lay between Antony and Octavian. Antony claimed the wealthy East, with its rich provinces, ancient cities, and the kingdom of Egypt on its borders. Octavian returned to Italy, inheriting the difficult task of settling Caesar's veterans and securing the western provinces. To bind their fragile alliance, Antony married Octavia, the sister of Octavian. For a time, peace seemed possible. The two heirs of Caesar had triumphed together, and the Republic's enemies lay dead. Yet ambition never sleeps. Antony's eyes turned eastward, drawn by the wealth of the provinces and by the allure of Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Octavian faced unrest at home, the burden of land distribution, and the challenge of commanding loyalty in Italy. The assassins of Caesar were gone. But Rome was not at peace. In 42 BC, on the fields of Philippi, the blades of civil war struck their final blow against Caesar's assassins. Brutus and Cassius were gone. The Republic's last defenders lay broken. Victory belonged to the triumvirs. Yet of the three, only two truly mattered now. Lepidus, granted Africa, was little more than a shadow. The real masters of Rome were Octavian and Mark Antony. In the years following Philippi, the triumvirs reshaped Rome's vast dominion. The spoils of empire were carved like a map upon the table. Antony claimed the East, the richest half of the Republic. He took Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and the wealthy client kingdoms that bordered Rome's frontiers. From these lands flowed gold, grain, and soldiers. The East offered power, and Antony meant to wield it. Octavian, meanwhile, assumed command of the West: Italy, Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa. It was a harsher inheritance. Italy was restless, filled with veterans demanding land, peasants driven to revolt, and cities strained by constant war. Yet in this cauldron of discontent, Octavian would prove his resilience. Lepidus, assigned Africa, was reduced to a bystander. His title as triumvir remained, but his influence was gone. To seal their alliance, Antony married Octavia, Octavian's sister, in 40 BC. It was a political match, designed to bind East and West together. Octavia was admired for her dignity and loyalty, and for a time, her presence softened tensions between her husband and her brother. Yet beneath the surface, ambition gnawed. As Antony governed the East and Octavian struggled to settle Italy, a new threat emerged from the sea. Sextus Pompeius, the son of Pompey the Great, had carved out a kingdom from the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. His fleets patrolled the Mediterranean, cutting off Rome's lifeline of grain. Without Sicilian harvests, famine stalked the capital. Sextus styled himself the defender of liberty, sheltering refugees from the proscriptions. But in truth, he ruled as a pirate king. His ships choked Rome's harbors, and his name became a curse among the hungry masses. In 39 BC, a temporary peace was arranged, the Pact of Misenum. Sextus was granted recognition in exchange for restoring the grain supply. For a brief moment, the seas calmed. But the truce was fragile. Within a year, hostilities resumed. Starvation returned, riots erupted, and Octavian's reputation faltered. It was then that Octavian turned to Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, his most brilliant general. Agrippa reorganized Rome's fleets, training sailors, constructing harbors, and building new ships. The struggle was long and bitter, but in 36 BC, Agrippa struck decisively. At Naulochus, off the coast of Sicily, Sextus's fleet was shattered. Defeated, Sextus fled eastward, seeking refuge. But fate caught him in Asia Minor, where he was executed. With his fall, Rome's grain supply was secured, and Octavian emerged stronger than ever. Victory over Sextus also brought the downfall of Lepidus. Once the battle was won, Lepidus attempted to reassert his power in Sicily. But his soldiers, bribed and coaxed by Octavian, deserted him. Stripped of command, Lepidus was cast aside. Yet Octavian, calculating as ever, spared his life. Lepidus was allowed to retire in dignity, holding the sacred title of Pontifex Maximus until his death. His political role, however, was finished. Now only two masters remained. Octavian ruled the West. Antony commanded the East. The uneasy balance of power was narrowing toward its final test. While Octavian consolidated his authority in Italy, Antony's gaze was fixed on Egypt. There ruled Cleopatra VII, Queen of the Nile, once the lover of Julius Caesar. Brilliant, charismatic, and cunning, she was more than a monarch. She was a symbol of wealth, exotic splendor, and independent power. Antony allied himself with her, and their partnership was both political and personal. Together they had children. Together they envisioned a realm that stretched beyond Rome's reach. Cleopatra received vast lands as gifts, carved from territories Rome considered her own. In 36 BC, Antony launched a grand campaign against the Parthians, Rome's greatest eastern rivals. But the expedition ended in disaster, with heavy losses and retreat through the winter snows. To restore his prestige, he turned to Armenia, and in 34 BC he staged a triumph. Yet the celebration did not take place in Rome. Instead, Antony held it in Alexandria. Cleopatra was enthroned beside him, their children paraded as heirs to kingdoms not yet theirs. To Roman eyes, this was scandal. Antony seemed less a Roman general than an Eastern monarch. He was abandoning the traditions of the Republic, surrendering himself to a foreign queen. Octavian seized upon this image, crafting propaganda that painted Antony as a traitor, seduced by Cleopatra, ready to betray Rome itself. Rome was now divided between two masters, Octavian in the west, Antony in the east. But Antony's bond with Cleopatra would become Octavian's greatest weapon. In the aftermath of Philippi, the Republic stood divided between two heirs of Caesar. Octavian ruled the west. Antony ruled the east. Yet their paths, though parallel, could not remain apart. Antony had bound himself to Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and from her throne in Alexandria, he sought to command the wealth and splendor of the eastern Mediterranean. Octavian, in Italy, consolidated his power, securing the loyalty of Rome's veterans and the Senate. But whispers spread across the city. Was Antony still a Roman, or had he become a monarch of the East? Had the great general abandoned Rome for a foreign queen? Two heirs remained. Only one could inherit Rome's destiny. Which would it be? Mark Antony's bond with Cleopatra was more than passion, it was politics. Egypt was the richest client kingdom of the Mediterranean, its Nile Valley producing grain enough to feed millions. Cleopatra's coffers brimmed with gold. Her fleets and armies stood ready to serve. For Antony, beset with the burdens of empire, she was an indispensable ally. For Cleopatra, Antony was both protector and partner. Together they envisioned a dynasty to rule beyond the Republic. Their union produced children: Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. In 34 BC, after his conquest of Armenia, Antony staged a grand spectacle in Alexandria, known to history as the Donations of Alexandria. Before a thronging crowd, Antony and Cleopatra sat enthroned as sovereigns of the East. Lands were distributed to their children. Alexander was declared king of Armenia and Media, Cleopatra Selene queen of Cyrene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus heir to Syria and Cilicia. Cleopatra herself was hailed as Queen of Kings. To Romans, the sight was shocking. Honors and territories that belonged to the Republic were handed to foreigners, children who owed nothing to Rome. Even Antony's triumph, which should have been celebrated in the streets of Rome, was staged in Alexandria. It was a gesture that Octavian would never allow the city to forget. Octavian understood that wars are won as much by words as by swords. He began to fashion a narrative. Antony had abandoned his Roman duty. He had surrendered himself to Cleopatra. He was no longer a guardian of Rome, but a traitor enthralled by the East. In 32 BC, Octavian seized his most potent weapon. Breaking into the temple of the Vestal Virgins, he secured a copy of Antony's will, which had been deposited there for safekeeping. The document was read aloud before the Senate and people. Its revelations were damning. Antony declared that his possessions should pass to Cleopatra's children. He wished to be buried not in Rome, but in Alexandria, beside her. For Romans, this was sacrilege. Burial in foreign soil was unthinkable for one of Caesar's heirs. To share a tomb with Cleopatra was to renounce his Roman identity. Octavian made certain every citizen knew the contents. He paraded the will as proof that Antony was no longer Roman, but Egyptian in heart and loyalty. His campaign was brilliant. The war that loomed was not framed as civil strife, brother against brother. Instead, it became a holy struggle, Rome against Egypt. In late 32 BC, the Senate formally revoked Antony's powers. War was declared, not upon Antony himself, but upon Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. By casting the conflict in this way, Octavian united the city behind him. To resist Antony was to resist foreign corruption. To support Octavian was to defend Rome's honor. Yet the Senate was divided. Nearly 40% of its members fled eastward to join Antony, including many of its most distinguished names. For them, Antony represented tradition and strength, Octavian youth and ambition. The Republic fractured once more, and two colossal powers began to arm. Each side mustered vast resources. Antony, with Cleopatra's backing, assembled perhaps 500 warships and close to 200,000 men. Octavian, with Agrippa at his side, gathered a fleet nearly as large, and armies drawn from Italy, Gaul, and Hispania. The stage was set for the greatest confrontation Rome had ever seen. Through 32 and into 31 BC, both sides prepared for war. Antony and Cleopatra concentrated their fleet at Actium, a promontory on the northwestern coast of Greece. From there, they could guard their supply routes and strike into the Adriatic. But fortune turned against them. Agrippa, Octavian's brilliant admiral, launched daring raids along the coasts, cutting Antony's lines of supply. Disease spread through Antony's camp. Desertions followed. Loyal kings and allies wavered. What had once seemed a mighty coalition now began to unravel. Octavian, though less a soldier than a politician, had the steady hand of Agrippa guiding his war effort. Together, they tightened the noose around Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. By the summer of 31 BC, there was no escape. The armies of Rome faced one another across the waters of Greece. On the 2nd of September, the fateful day arrived. The Battle of Actium would decide not only who ruled Rome, but whether the Republic itself would ever rise again. On the shores of Greece, two colossal fleets prepared for battle. The summer of 31 BC brought Rome to the edge of destiny. In the east, Antony and Cleopatra commanded a vast fleet and armies drawn from Greece, Asia, and Egypt. In the west, Octavian rallied Italy and Gaul under his name, with Agrippa, his brilliant general, guiding strategy. Their forces gathered on the shores of northwestern Greece, near the promontory of Actium. The sea lay calm, but beneath its surface the future of Rome trembled. This was no ordinary campaign. It was the final test between two heirs of Caesar. Would Rome's fate be shaped by Antony, bound to Cleopatra and the East, or by Octavian, who promised to defend tradition and restore order? The answer would come upon the waters of Actium. Antony's position, though mighty on paper, was precarious in reality. His fleet, perhaps 500 ships, included enormous galleys with towering decks and heavy rams. They were imposing but cumbersome, difficult to maneuver in tight waters. His armies occupied strongholds along the coast of Greece. Yet within his camp, morale faltered. Disease spread among his soldiers, cutting down thousands. Supplies dwindled, for Agrippa's naval campaigns harried the coastlines, intercepting transports and seizing key positions. One by one, Antony's lines of support collapsed. Adding to his troubles was Cleopatra's presence. With her Egyptian fleet anchored alongside Antony's, whispers spread among his officers. Many questioned her influence, believing she swayed Antony's every decision. Her presence deepened suspicions that Antony had ceased to be a Roman general and had become Cleopatra's consort, serving Egypt's crown. Meanwhile, Octavian advanced cautiously. He lacked Antony's personal charisma in the field, but he had Agrippa. Agrippa struck relentlessly at Antony's supplies, forcing the enemy into tighter quarters. As the weeks dragged on, Antony grew desperate. His only hope was to break through Octavian's blockade and reach open waters, where his heavier ships might find advantage. And so he chose battle. Dawn broke on the 2nd of September, 31 BC. The sea mist lifted slowly from the Ambracian Gulf. From their decks, Antony's soldiers watched as the horizon filled with Octavian's smaller, swifter vessels commanded by Agrippa. Antony gave the order. The fleet would attempt to break out into the Ionian Sea. If they failed, they would be trapped. The clash began with maneuvers, lines of ships straining against the wind and current. Antony's great galleys advanced, their oars churning, their decks bristling with archers and marines. But Octavian's ships, lighter and quicker, darted in and out, avoiding direct collision, striking where the enemy was most vulnerable. Fire became a weapon. Pitch-soaked missiles hurled across the waves set decks ablaze. Black smoke billowed, stinging the eyes of men and blotting out the sun. Agrippa pressed the attack, encircling Antony's unwieldy fleet. Then fortune betrayed Antony. The winds shifted, driving his ships back toward the shore. Some historians speak of the dead water effect, a strange stillness of the sea that robbed the great vessels of momentum. Whatever the cause, Antony's fleet stalled. In the midst of the chaos, Cleopatra acted. With her squadron of 60 ships, she broke from the line and sailed south, fleeing the battle. Seeing her banners depart, Antony made his fateful choice. Abandoning his struggling fleet, he leapt into a smaller vessel and followed her. The sight shattered the morale of his men. Leaderless, encircled, they fought on briefly, but Agrippa's assault crushed them. Ships burned, sank, or surrendered. By nightfall, Antony's naval power was annihilated. The waters of Actium boiled with wreckage and bodies. Rome's greatest civil war had been decided not by legions on land, but by ships on the sea. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria. Behind them lay ruin. Greece fell swiftly into Octavian's hands. Thousands of men deserted, pledging loyalty to Caesar's heir. Vast stores of treasure poured into Octavian's coffers, spoils that would finance his path to absolute rule. In Rome, the news spread like wildfire. Antony was condemned as a deserter, a man who had abandoned his soldiers for a queen. Octavian, by contrast, was hailed as the savior of Rome, the one who had broken the power of the East and defended the Republic. But the war was not yet finished. Antony and Cleopatra still commanded forces in Egypt. Octavian would not rest until they were destroyed. Suspense tightened with each passing month. All knew the final confrontation would come not in Greece, but on the banks of the Nile. In 30 BC, Octavian marched into Egypt. His legions advanced with little resistance, for Antony's forces, demoralized and depleted, melted away. The once mighty general, who had commanded Rome's armies from Gaul to Parthia, now found himself cornered in Alexandria. In a final skirmish, Antony was defeated once more. Shattered by despair, he fell upon his own sword. Some accounts tell of a bungled attempt, others of a faithful servant assisting him. Carried bleeding to Cleopatra's mausoleum, he died in her arms. 9 days later, Cleopatra too met her end. Legends speak of the asp, the serpent whose bite carried her to death. More likely, she drank poison, choosing her own fate rather than parading as a captive in Octavian's triumph. Their children were spared, though used as tokens of Rome's power. But Caesarion, Julius Caesar's son by Cleopatra, was not. Too many Caesars is not good, Octavian is said to have remarked. Caesarion was quietly executed, erasing the last rival claimant to Caesar's legacy. Egypt was annexed, its immense wealth flowing into Roman hands. Octavian now controlled the richest province in the Mediterranean. Gold, grain, and glory poured into his treasury, cementing his supremacy. With Antony and Cleopatra dead, Octavian stood alone. Rome's last great civil war was over. In the wake of Actium, the fate of Rome was sealed. Antony and Cleopatra were dead. Egypt was annexed, its unimaginable wealth flowing into Roman coffers. By 30 BC, Octavian stood unchallenged as the master of the Mediterranean world. Yet he faced a dilemma. He could not call himself Rex, king, for Romans despised the word. Nor could he embrace the title of dictator, as Caesar had done, for Caesar's fate had shown how quickly daggers awaited such ambition. The memory of Julius Caesar hung heavy over the city. Caesar had claimed too much, too openly. Dictator for life, he had flaunted his supremacy and worn the crown of power too plainly. For this, he was struck down. Octavian learned from his adoptive father's fate. His rule would be crafted in subtlety, not in spectacle. He presented himself not as the destroyer of the Republic, but as its savior. He began with gestures of humility. Soldiers were dismissed and sent to colonies, their demands for land carefully balanced with the peace of Italy. In public, Octavian spoke of laying down extraordinary powers, declaring that the Republic must be restored to the Senate and the people. Yet beneath this facade, the reality was different. The legions still answered to him. The treasury, enriched with Egyptian gold, was under his command. Governors of the most crucial provinces deferred to him alone. Octavian's grip on power was firm, but it was wrapped in the garments of tradition. Rome, weary of war, welcomed this restraint. Peace, even under hidden monarchy, was better than chaos. In January of 27 BC, Octavian made his masterstroke. He rose in the Senate and formally declared that he would return all authority to the Senate and people of Rome. It was a carefully staged performance, designed to echo the noble humility of Rome's ancestors. The senators, many of whom owed their careers and safety to Octavian, responded as expected. They urged him to retain power for the safety of the state. They knew the truth. Without him, the Republic would collapse again into bloodshed. And so they granted him new honors and titles. He was given the title Princeps, first citizen. Unlike dictator or king, this name carried the aura of modesty. He was not above his peers, he claimed, only the foremost among equals. It was a fiction, but one the people could accept. More than this, he was awarded a new honorific, Augustus. The name was unprecedented, carrying connotations of reverence, majesty, and sacredness. It marked him not merely as Octavian, the man, but as Augustus, the revered one. With that title, a new age began. Historians mark this moment, the settlement of 27 BC, as the birth of the Roman Empire. The Republic had died quietly, not with daggers in the Senate, but with applause in its chamber. Augustus knew his survival depended on balance. He left to the Senate the governance of peaceful provinces, places where legions were unnecessary. To himself, he claimed the more volatile regions, Syria, Egypt, Hispania, and the frontiers where armies were stationed. In this way, he maintained supreme military authority without stripping the Senate of all dignity. His wealth, drawn from conquest and the spoils of Egypt, allowed him to bind men to his cause with patronage. He rewarded loyalty, financed building projects, and secured the devotion of both soldiers and citizens. He avoided the mistakes of Caesar. Where Caesar had flaunted crowns and titles, Augustus cloaked himself in the language of tradition. He spoke always of the Republic, of laws, of institutions. Yet everyone knew who truly commanded Rome. The civil wars had ended. Rome at last breathed again. One title came to define him above all, Imperator. Once, this had been the acclamation of legions to a victorious commander. Now, it became fused with Augustus's very identity. He was Imperator Caesar Augustus, the commander whose authority flowed not from office alone, but from victory, loyalty, and destiny. He was no king, for he wore no crown. He was no dictator, for he claimed no tyrant's power. He was something new, Rome's first emperor, cloaked in the forms of the Republic. His rule was absolute, but it was palatable, softened by illusion. In this delicate balance, Augustus achieved what no Roman before him had done. He founded an empire without declaring one. In 27 BC, Octavian became Augustus, the first citizen, yet master of Rome. But founding an empire was only the beginning. The question now was whether he could preserve it. In 27 BC, Octavian shed his old name and rose as Augustus, the illustrious one. The Senate hailed him as Princeps, the first citizen, but in truth he was Rome's master. The Republic still wore its ancient robes, yet beneath them a new monarchy had taken shape. Within Rome, peace returned after decades of civil strife. But beyond the city walls, the empire's borders were restless. Tribes defied Rome's authority. Client kings balanced uneasily between loyalty and independence. Rivals like Parthia watched for weakness. Even before his new title, Augustus had overseen one of Rome's greatest prizes. In 30 BC, Egypt fell to his armies. With the suicides of Antony and Cleopatra, the kingdom of the Nile became a Roman province. Its fertile fields, watered by the eternal river, yielded grain enough to feed half the empire. Its treasuries brimmed with gold and silver. From Alexandria, wealth flowed into Rome, enriching Augustus's coffers and giving him the means to secure loyalty at home. 5 years later, in 25 BC, fortune favored him again. King Amyntas of Galatia, a Roman ally ruling the rugged heart of Asia Minor, died without an heir. Augustus swiftly annexed the kingdom. Galatia's territory extended Rome's influence deeper into the Anatolian plateau, securing trade routes and fortifying the eastern frontier. These additions were not merely land. They were symbols of Rome's supremacy. Augustus envisioned the Mediterranean as a Roman lake, its shores bound together under his authority. Egypt, Galatia, and the provinces already under Roman command formed the foundation of a new imperial order. But expansion did not always come easily. In the wild mountains of northern Hispania, tribes of the Cantabri and Astures had resisted Roman conquest for centuries. For generations, they had defied legions with ambushes, mountain strongholds, and relentless guerrilla warfare. Augustus resolved to finish what others had failed to complete. In 26 BC, he traveled in person to Spain, taking command of the campaign. From his base at Segisama, he directed vast forces against the tribes. The struggle was brutal. The Cantabri fought with desperation, refusing surrender. The Asturians, too, resisted fiercely, striking Roman columns and melting back into the mountains. Roman sources speak of sieges, mass executions, and entire villages driven to despair. Some reports claim tribespeople chose death by their own hands rather than slavery. For years the war dragged on, consuming men and resources. Disease struck Augustus himself, forcing him to withdraw to Tarraco, where he nearly died. But the legions pressed forward under his lieutenants. By 19 BC, the resistance was broken. The last Cantabrian warriors fell, and the northern frontier of Hispania was secured. Victory yielded more than stability. The region held rich deposits of gold, silver, and iron. Mines in Hispania poured wealth into the empire, financing Augustus's reforms and monuments. The conquest had been costly, but it left Rome stronger than ever. In the east, Augustus faced a different challenge. The Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival, still cast a shadow across the Euphrates. Decades earlier, in 53 BC, the Roman general Crassus had been crushed at Carrhae, his legions slaughtered and their standards captured. The loss had haunted Roman pride for generations. Antony had once attempted to redeem that shame with his disastrous Parthian campaign. Augustus, wiser, chose another path. Rather than plunge into endless war across the deserts of Mesopotamia, he used diplomacy and pressure. In 20 BC, he achieved what no general's sword had won. The Parthians agreed to return the captured standards to Rome. It was a bloodless triumph, but a triumph nonetheless. Statues and monuments across the empire displayed Augustus receiving the eagles, a symbol of vengeance fulfilled without war. To the people of Rome, it was as glorious as a conquest. To Augustus, it proved that statesmanship could achieve what reckless ambition could not. Beyond Parthia lay fragile lands where Rome's influence was felt, but not absolute. Augustus understood the value of client kings, local rulers who held power in their own right, but owed allegiance to Rome. By guiding their reigns, he extended Roman control without the burden of constant warfare. In Judea, Herod the Great ruled with Augustus's blessing. Though feared and ruthless, Herod kept order and ensured the flow of tribute. In Armenia, Augustus played a delicate game, balancing Roman influence against Parthian pressure. Elsewhere in Cappadocia, Commagene, and Mauritania, client kings ruled at Rome's pleasure. This system gave Augustus reach without overextension. Roman soldiers stood ready on the borders, but Augustus preferred that others bear the cost of maintaining peace. He understood that an empire was not only won by legions, but sustained by diplomacy, wealth, and careful alliances. By the early 20s BC, Augustus seemed unshakable. Egypt's wealth filled his coffers. Spain was pacified after centuries of resistance. Galatia was annexed into the empire. Even Rome's great rival, Parthia, had bowed to his diplomacy, returning the eagles lost decades earlier at Carrhae. Rome had never appeared stronger. The Mediterranean lay united under one master. Monuments rose in the city, celebrating peace and prosperity. And then in 23 BC, everything nearly collapsed. Augustus fell gravely ill. For weeks he lingered between life and death. The empire, so newly born, stood on the brink of chaos. The sickness struck suddenly. Some accounts suggest fever, others a wasting illness. Whatever its nature, it weakened Augustus so severely that many believed he would not recover. In Rome, rumors spread wildly. Some whispered of poison. Others spoke of divine judgment. On his bed, Augustus prepared for the worst. He knew that the fragile peace he had built could not survive a reckless succession. Yet he also knew he could not openly declare an heir to the throne, without provoking memories of monarchy, the very idea Romans despised. His solution was delicate. He divided responsibility between two men. For military command, he turned to Marcus Agrippa, his closest ally and Rome's greatest general. For political succession, he began to groom his young nephew Marcellus, son of his beloved sister Octavia. The balance was precarious, two pillars, one of experience, one of blood. Together, they might have supported the new order. But fate would not allow it. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa was more than a friend. He was Augustus's indispensable partner, the man without whom Octavian's rise might never have been possible. At Actium, it was Agrippa's genius that had secured victory. In Spain, his legions had finished the conquest of the Cantabrian tribes. In Rome, he oversaw aqueducts, harbors, and baths that transformed the city. Loyal, capable, and unpretentious, Agrippa was everything Augustus needed in a lieutenant. In the crisis of 23 BC, Augustus gave him extraordinary powers. To bind him closer, he arranged Agrippa's marriage to Julia, his only daughter. With this union, Agrippa became not only Rome's military guardian, but part of the Julian family itself. To many, Agrippa was second in command of the empire. He could be trusted with legions, provinces, and the loyalty of veterans. He was the arm of Augustus's vision, and for a time, it seemed he might even be the guardian of Augustus's dynasty. But Augustus also looked to family. His nephew Marcellus, still in his teens, had been marked out for high office. Married to Julia before Agrippa, granted honors far beyond his years, Marcellus was groomed as the political heir, the young star of the Julian line. In 23 BC, tragedy struck. Marcellus died suddenly, perhaps of illness, though some later whispered of poison and intrigue. He was only 20. The grief was immense. Augustus wept openly. Rome mourned with him, for the boy had been a symbol of the future. Even poets joined in the lament. In Virgil's Aeneid, composed soon after, a haunting passage describes the shade of young Marcellus, destined for greatness yet cut down too soon. The people heard it and remembered. With Marcellus gone, succession became dangerously uncertain. The Julian line was young and fragile. The empire had no clear heir. Augustus was forced to rethink his plans, knowing that without a stable dynasty, his new order might crumble after his death. From the crisis of 23 BC came transformation. Augustus realized he could no longer rely on holding the consulship year after year. Such dominance had made Caesar a target. Instead, he crafted a new settlement, reshaping his authority into forms the Republic could accept. He resigned the consulship. In its place, he assumed the powers of the tribunician potestas, the authority of the tribune of the plebs. It gave him the right to propose laws, to veto the Senate, and to protect the people. Unlike the traditional office, his power was permanent, renewed each year for life. At the same time, he claimed censorial authority, allowing him to oversee the Senate, control public morals, and regulate the Roman order. These powers, combined with his imperium over the provinces and armies, made Augustus supreme. Yet because they were cloaked in republican tradition, they did not appear tyrannical. Augustus survived his illness, but Rome had seen how fragile peace could be. The empire's stability depended not only on Augustus's strength, but on the uncertain question of succession. By 23 BC, Augustus had survived his brush with death. His reforms reshaped power into lasting forms, cloaked in republican tradition but absolute in practice. The empire seemed secure. Yet one question haunted Rome, a question that no constitution could resolve. Who would succeed him? Augustus was still young, but his illness had revealed the fragility of peace. If he died, everything could collapse into civil war once more. For the survival of Rome, succession had to be solved. But in a world where kingship was hated and monarchy despised, how could he pass power to an heir without seeming a tyrant? The answer lay not in law, but in family. Augustus would build his dynasty through marriage and blood. And at the center of that plan stood his only child, Julia. Julia, later known as Julia the Elder, was born in 39 BC, daughter of Augustus and his second wife, Scribonia. She was the only natural child Augustus would ever have. From the start, Julia was destined not for personal freedom, but for political purpose. Her mother, Scribonia, was soon set aside. Augustus divorced her the very day Julia was born, leaving the infant to be raised in the strict household of her father. For Augustus, Julia was never merely a daughter. She was a living bond, a thread through which his power could pass to future generations. In 25 BC, Julia was married to Marcellus, Augustus's nephew, and the young man he once seemed to favor as heir. Their union symbolized the merging of bloodlines, binding the Julian family closer together. But when Marcellus died in 23 BC, Julia became once again a piece on Augustus's dynastic chessboard. Her role was clear. Through her marriages, Augustus would shape the destiny of Rome. In 21 BC, Augustus arranged a new match for his daughter. Julia was wed to Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, his most trusted general, his loyal partner, and the man who had secured victory at Actium. The marriage was more than personal union. It was political strategy of the highest order. By wedding Julia to Agrippa, Augustus ensured that his greatest ally was also bound to him by blood. Agrippa, already indispensable, was now family. The marriage was fruitful. Julia and Agrippa had 5 children, and among them 2 sons who would soon carry the hopes of the empire: Gaius Caesar, born in 20 BC, and Lucius Caesar, born in 17 BC. Augustus adored them. He adopted both boys as his own sons, elevating them as heirs to his name and legacy. For the people of Rome, their birth was a blessing. Festivals and celebrations honored them. Statues depicted Augustus surrounded not only by power, but by family. At last, it seemed a dynasty was forming, one that could secure peace for generations. The Julian house had heirs. The empire had a future. But succession was not only about children. It was also about strength in the present. Agrippa provided that strength. He was more than a general. As Augustus's partner, he governed provinces, commanded armies, and even reshaped the city of Rome itself. He built aqueducts that carried water into the capital, grand baths for the people, and temples that honored the gods. The Pantheon's first form, constructed under his guidance, stood as a marvel of architecture and devotion. In every sphere, military, political, civic, Agrippa was Augustus's right hand. Unlike so many rivals of the past, he never grasped for power in his own name. He was content to serve, loyal beyond measure. Together, Augustus and Agrippa offered Rome a rare gift: stability. The empire was not ruled by one man alone, but by a partnership that blended vision with execution. To the Senate, to the people, and to the provinces, it seemed Rome's future was secured. By the late teens BC, the plan was clear. Gaius and Lucius Caesar were the chosen heirs, the young princes of the Julian house. Adopted by Augustus, they carried the name Caesar and were marked out for glory. Rome embraced them with enthusiasm. The people celebrated their birthdays with games. Honors were lavished upon them even in childhood, signaling that the next generation of Caesars was already being prepared for rule. It seemed at last that the endless chaos of succession was over. No more rival generals. No more bloody struggles for power. Augustus would pass the empire to his sons, and through them to a dynasty. But fate is rarely so kind. In 12 BC, tragedy struck. Marcus Agrippa, the loyal partner, the architect of Augustus's reign, died suddenly at the age of 51. His loss was devastating. Without him, the foundation of Augustus's system crumbled. Now the future rested not on the shoulders of seasoned generals, but upon children far too young to rule, and a family soon to be troubled by scandal. For a brief moment, Augustus seemed to have secured the future. Through his daughter Julia and his trusted partner Marcus Agrippa, he had heirs, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, young boys celebrated as the princes of Rome. They carried not only his blood, but also the legacy of Julius Caesar. But in 12 BC, disaster struck. Marcus Agrippa, Augustus's loyal general, ally, and co-ruler, died suddenly. Rome lost its greatest commander. Augustus lost the man upon whom his reign had most depended. Marcus Agrippa's life had been one of service. He had been at Octavian's side from the beginning, guiding armies, building fleets, and winning victories that shaped history. At Actium, it was Agrippa's naval brilliance that crushed Antony and Cleopatra. In Spain, he finished the conquest of the Cantabri. In Rome itself, he left monuments that would endure for centuries: harbors, aqueducts, temples, and the first Pantheon. To Augustus, Agrippa was more than a general. He was a brother in all but blood. He had married Julia, fathered Augustus's heirs, and shared power with loyalty unmatched by any Roman. In 12 BC, at the age of only 51, Agrippa died. Some sources speak of sudden illness, others of exhaustion after years of tireless work. Whatever the cause, his loss was shattering. Augustus wept openly. Politically, the empire had lost its strongest pillar. Personally, Augustus had lost the one man he trusted beyond doubt. From that moment, Augustus stood alone. All future hopes would rest not on seasoned allies, but on the uncertain promise of family. Augustus had already begun preparing the next generation. In 17 BC, he formally adopted Gaius and Lucius, sons of Julia and Agrippa. Though only children, they were presented to Rome as the heirs of empire. Their adoption was celebrated with grandeur. Ceremonies honored them, coins were minted in their names, and the people cheered the image of Augustus surrounded by youthful successors. It was a vision of continuity, of a dynasty that might endure. Gaius, born in 20 BC, was bright and ambitious. Lucius, younger by 3 years, carried equal promise. Augustus raised them in the public eye, granting them honors far beyond their years. They were named Princes of the Youth, a title that marked them as the hope of Rome's future. By granting them early magistracies and symbolic commands, Augustus shaped them for rule. Rome's citizens watched as the empire's next rulers grew before their eyes. For the first time in centuries, it seemed Rome might avoid civil war at a leader's death. Yet hope is fragile, and dynasties are never secure. At the center of this vision stood Julia the Elder, mother of the heirs. In public, she appeared as the matron of Rome, the woman through whom Augustus's dynasty was born. But in private, her life was far different. Whispers began to spread of her behavior, affairs with senators, nights of revelry, reckless indulgence. Augustus, who had built his rule upon moral authority, could not ignore the scandal. The man who had legislated strict laws against adultery now found his own daughter at the center of disgrace. In 2 BC, Julia was formally accused of multiple adulteries. The evidence was overwhelming. For Augustus, it was a wound both personal and political. He could not spare her. To show mercy would be to betray the very laws he had enforced upon others. Julia was exiled to the barren island of Pandateria, stripped of her wealth and reputation. Rome was shocked. The mother of the heirs had fallen in shame. For Augustus, it was agony. He had banished his only child. But for the empire, it was worse. The prestige of the dynasty had been stained. With Agrippa gone and Julia disgraced, Augustus's dynasty rested on 2 boys, Gaius and Lucius Caesar. Rome celebrated them as the future, but beneath the surface, danger loomed. They were too young to rule, too untested to secure loyalty. Their very youth made the empire fragile. Augustus, now aging, understood the risk. He had built his empire upon peace, but peace depended on succession. If his heirs faltered, civil war could return, and fate, merciless as ever, would strike again. Both Gaius and Lucius would die young, plunging Augustus once more into despair and crisis. For years, Augustus placed his hopes in the promise of youth. His adopted sons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, the children of Julia and Agrippa, were raised before the eyes of the empire as its future rulers. Festivals honored them. Honors were heaped upon them long before they reached manhood. Rome looked to them as the heirs of Augustus and the continuation of Caesar's legacy. But fate is merciless. In the first years of the new century, tragedy struck again. One heir after another was lost, and with them, Augustus's dream of a dynasty descended into ruin. The first blow came in 2 AD. Lucius Caesar, Augustus's younger adopted son, was traveling in the south of Gaul. He had left Italy to assume an honorary command in Spain, a mark of his rising prestige. But on the journey, in the city of Massilia, modern Marseille, he fell ill. The sickness struck swiftly, and at only 19 years of age, Lucius was dead. The news reached Rome like a thunderclap. Mourning spread through the empire. Augustus, who had lavished so much care upon his grandson, was devastated. The boy had been born into privilege, raised to inherit the world, yet his life ended before he had even held true command. Public grief was profound. Lucius had been a symbol of Rome's future, and with his death, that future suddenly looked fragile. But worse was still to come. Only 2 years later, in 4 AD, tragedy struck again. Gaius Caesar, elder brother of Lucius, had been sent eastward on campaign. At 23 years old, he was already hailed as a rising statesman and commander. In Armenia, Gaius was wounded during a skirmish. The injury at first seemed minor, but infection set in. Months of weakness followed. Far from Rome, surrounded by soldiers and officials, Gaius lingered until his strength failed. At the beginning of that year, he died. The empire plunged into grief. 2 heirs, raised before the eyes of the people, were gone within 2 years. Augustus's succession plan, carefully crafted, celebrated across Rome, was shattered. For Augustus, the loss was personal agony. These were not only heirs but beloved grandsons. He had raised them, prepared them, imagined them carrying his legacy into the future. Now they were gone. The dynasty he had built seemed cursed. Only one direct grandson remained, Agrippa Posthumus, the youngest child of Julia and Agrippa, born after his father's death, hence his name Posthumus. But Agrippa Posthumus was no Gaius or Lucius. Accounts describe him as violent, unstable, and ill-suited for the delicacy of rule. His temper alienated allies. His behavior alarmed Augustus. For a time, Augustus kept him within the circle of succession. But by 6 AD, his patience ended. Agrippa Posthumus was exiled to the island of Planasia, far from Rome, stripped of influence. Officially, the reason was misconduct. Some whispered darker motives, that Livia, Augustus's powerful wife, maneuvered to remove rivals in favor of her own son. The truth remains uncertain. With the deaths of Gaius and Lucius, and the disgrace of Posthumus, Augustus had no choice but to look elsewhere. His gaze turned reluctantly to his stepson, Tiberius. Tiberius was the son of Livia by her first husband, adopted into Augustus's household after their marriage. He was a capable general, seasoned in campaigns in Germany, Pannonia, and the Balkans. His military record was solid, his political reputation respectable, yet he was never Augustus's first choice. Tiberius himself resented the role. He knew he was only chosen because others had died. He had lived in the shadow of Gaius and Lucius, aware that Augustus preferred them. Worse still, Augustus did not trust him completely. Their relationship was cool, distant, marked more by necessity than affection. Nevertheless, in 4 AD, Augustus formally adopted Tiberius as his son. To strengthen the arrangement, he paired him with Germanicus, a popular young general beloved by the legions. Tiberius would rule in the present. Germanicus was intended to rule in the future. It was a compromise born of desperation. Augustus had not chosen Tiberius out of love or admiration, but out of necessity. With the deaths of Gaius and Lucius Caesar, Augustus's carefully built succession plan collapsed. Reluctantly, he turned to Tiberius, his stepson, as heir. The choice was one of necessity, not love. Within the palace, the question of inheritance remained unsettled and uneasy. But beyond Rome's walls, the empire faced challenges far greater than dynastic quarrels. Augustus's later years were shaped by campaigns on the frontiers, wars fought in rugged lands and forests, where Rome's strength was tested and its ambitions checked. For while Augustus claimed to have brought peace to the world, the edges of empire were anything but peaceful. To Rome, the Balkans were both gateway and frontier. Across Pannonia, Illyria, and Moesia, lands that stretched through modern Croatia, Serbia, and the Danube basin, tribes resisted Roman domination. These regions were vital. Controlling them meant securing a continuous corridor from Italy to Greece, binding the empire's heart to its eastern provinces. In the last decades of Augustus's reign, Rome pushed aggressively into these territories. Legions established roads, forts, and colonies. Some tribes submitted. Others resisted. The fiercest test came in 6 AD, when rebellion erupted on a massive scale. Known as the Great Illyrian Revolt, it spread across Pannonia and Dalmatia. Roman sources describe it as one of the gravest wars since Hannibal's time. Nearly 800,000 rebels rose, threatening to overwhelm Roman garrisons. For 3 years, war raged in the mountains and valleys. Entire legions were tied down in brutal campaigns. Villages burned. Thousands died. Yet Rome's discipline endured. By 9 AD, the revolt was finally crushed. The victory was costly but decisive. With Illyria subdued, Rome secured its Balkan frontier, establishing a chain of provinces that would serve as the empire's shield in the centuries to come. If the Balkans tested Rome's endurance, Germania tested its ambition. Augustus dreamed of pushing the empire's borders beyond the Rhine, to tame the vast forests and rivers of the Germanic tribes. Conquest here would give Rome security, preventing invasions into Gaul and opening fertile new lands. Campaigns began under Drusus, the brilliant stepson of Augustus, who led Roman forces deep into Germania in the late 1st century BC. He advanced farther than any Roman before him, reaching the Elbe River by 9 BC. For a moment, it seemed Germania might indeed fall under Roman rule. After Drusus's death, command passed to Tiberius, and later to Germanicus. Forts were built, roads carved into the wilderness. Tribes were subdued and treaties signed. By 7 BC, Roman authority stretched far beyond the Rhine. The dream was alive. Germania, the wild frontier, might soon become another province of the empire. But dreams can shatter, and in the dark forests east of the Rhine, Rome's greatest disaster awaited. In 9 AD, Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of the new territories, marched with 3 legions into the heart of Germania. Varus believed he was dealing with allies, pacifying a land already secured. At his side was Arminius, a Germanic noble who had served in the Roman army, trusted as a friend. But Arminius had betrayed him. As the legions advanced through dense, rain-soaked forests, the trap was sprung. Narrow paths hemmed in the columns. Storms turned the ground to mud. Supplies faltered. Suddenly, Germanic warriors fell upon them from all sides. What followed was slaughter. Roman shields and armor were useless in the thick woods. Ambush after ambush cut the legions to pieces. Camps were overrun, standards captured, men hunted down. For days the massacre continued, until nothing remained. 3 entire legions, perhaps 15,000 men, were annihilated. Their eagles, Rome's sacred standards, were taken by the enemy. When news reached Rome, the city reeled in shock. Augustus, now an old man, was said to tear at his clothes and cry out in anguish, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions!" The cry echoed Rome's despair. The greatest empire the world had known had been humbled in a forest by men it had dismissed as barbarians. The disaster forced a reckoning. Augustus abandoned his dream of extending Rome's frontier to the Elbe. The Rhine would remain the empire's northern boundary. Beyond it lay Germania unconquered, forever a threat, but never again a province. The legions rebuilt their defenses, constructing massive forts along the Rhine. Punitive campaigns recovered some honor, and eventually 2 of the lost standards were reclaimed. But the lesson was clear. Rome's power was vast, yet not limitless. In the twilight of Augustus's reign, expansion gave way to consolidation. The Balkans were secured, but Germania remained beyond reach. The empire was strong, but its borders were now defined as much by defeat as by victory. The legions had carried Rome's eagles across continents. In the Balkans, rebellion was crushed. In Germania, ambition was broken at Teutoburg. Augustus, in his later years, turned from the frontiers back to the city that ruled them all. For decades, Rome had been a place of chaos, fires, riots, corruption, and crime. If Augustus's empire was to endure, it would need more than conquests. It would need order within the very walls of Rome. How does a man who won power through civil war transform a city of disorder into the stable heart of an empire? This was the challenge Augustus now faced. The Rome Augustus inherited was immense, but deeply unstable. By the late Republic, it was the largest city the world had ever seen, swelling with more than 1 million souls. Veterans returning from war, peasants driven from farms, freedmen and slaves, all crowded into the city's cramped streets. The city was ill-prepared for such numbers. Tenement buildings, called insulae, prone to collapse or fire. Narrow alleyways made firefighting nearly impossible. At night, darkness invited thieves and gangs. Violence was common. Even senators could be attacked on their way to the forum. Politics had fed the chaos. During the last century of the Republic, ambitious leaders bought votes with bribes or intimidated rivals with street mobs. Fire and bloodshed had scarred the city. Rome, mistress of the world, was itself without order. Augustus recognized that an empire could not rest upon such a foundation. If Rome was to lead, it must be secured first from within. Augustus's first step was to bring safety to the city. Around 6 AD, he established the vigiles, Rome's first professional corps dedicated to public order. Divided into cohorts, drawn largely from freedmen, the vigiles patrolled the streets by night. They carried buckets, hooks, and axes to fight fires, which had so often reduced entire districts to ash. They also acted as a rudimentary police force, breaking up brawls, and keeping watch when the city slept. For ordinary Romans, this was transformative. Fires were no longer left to chance or the goodwill of neighbors. Criminals faced organized patrols rather than unchecked liberty. The vigiles did not make Rome safe overnight, but they introduced something new, the sense that the state itself protected its citizens. It was the beginning of civic order on an imperial scale. But while Augustus created safety for the people, he also secured himself. From the remnants of his personal bodyguards, he formed an elite corps, the Praetorian Guard. These soldiers were no ordinary legionaries. Hand-picked, well-paid, and stationed in and around Rome, they answered not to Senate or magistrates, but to Augustus alone. Their task was to protect the emperor and to guarantee stability in Italy itself. The creation of the Praetorians was a masterstroke. Publicly, Augustus presented them as guardians of order. Privately, they ensured his rule could not be challenged. For the first time, Rome had an armed force stationed permanently in its capital. This was a precedent that would echo through the centuries. In time, the Praetorians would become kingmakers, feared for their power. But under Augustus, they were his shield, silent and formidable. Securing Rome itself was only part of the task. To govern a vast empire stretching from Spain to Syria, Augustus needed a system that was efficient, fair, and enduring. He reformed taxation, replacing chaotic levies with regular, predictable systems. Landowners across the provinces paid a fixed land tax. Merchants trading goods paid customs duties. For the first time, provinces were organized into a census system, recording wealth, population, and obligations to the state. Augustus also redrew the map of governance. Peaceful, wealthy provinces were entrusted to the Senate, maintaining the illusion of republican tradition. But the provinces that held legions, the frontiers of danger and opportunity, were reserved for Augustus himself. Thus, the Senate kept dignity, but Augustus kept the armies. Egypt was made unique. As the empire's richest land, it was ruled not by a senator, but by a prefect of the equestrian order, directly responsible to Augustus. Senators were forbidden to enter without his permission. Egypt was his private domain, the jewel of his power. To tie the empire together, Augustus oversaw roads and relay stations, enabling couriers to carry messages across thousands of miles with astonishing speed. Communication became the lifeblood of administration, allowing orders from Rome to reach Britain, Gaul, or Syria in days instead of months. These reforms were not glamorous. They lacked the drama of Actium or the spectacle of triumph. Yet they formed the backbone of empire. They made Rome governable not as a republic of city-states, but as a unified whole. By the middle of his reign, Augustus had secured Rome's borders and reshaped its government. He had defeated rivals, crushed rebellions, and survived crises of succession. The empire stood strong. But Augustus's legacy was not forged by war alone. His reign also transformed Rome's soul. Under his patronage, literature and art flourished. History and poetry glorified the empire. Marble monuments rose above the forum. This was more than politics. It was culture. Under Augustus, Rome experienced its greatest age of creativity, an age that would define civilization for centuries. At the center of this cultural flowering stood Gaius Maecenas. More than a political ally, he was a trusted confidant of Augustus, a man who wielded influence not through office but through taste and vision. Maecenas was Rome's great patron. He gathered poets and writers, providing them with estates, wealth, and security. Through his generosity, art and literature became tools not only of beauty, but of politics. Poets wrote of peace after civil war, of Rome's eternal destiny, of Augustus himself as restorer of order. Though Augustus rarely commissioned works directly, Maecenas ensured that artists flourished in ways that served imperial ideals. His patronage created the climate in which Rome's cultural giants wrote their masterpieces. Through Maecenas, the empire found its voice. Foremost among those voices was Publius Vergilius Maro, Virgil. Supported by Maecenas, he composed the Aeneid, Rome's national epic. In 12 books of hexameter verse, Virgil told the story of Aeneas, the Trojan hero who fled the ruins of Troy to find a new homeland in Italy. From Aeneas's line, Rome itself would be born. The Aeneid was more than myth. It was prophecy. It traced Rome's destiny back to the gods, presenting Augustus as the fulfillment of fate. In its verses, civil war gave way to peace, chaos to order, despair to hope. For centuries, it would stand as the epic of Rome. Alongside Virgil was Horace. His odes and epistles praised moderation, civic duty, and the peace of Augustus's rule. He spoke of the golden mean, the balance of life, and celebrated the end of civil strife under Augustus's hand. His poetry captured the spirit of an age that sought stability after generations of turmoil. But not all poets fit easily into this vision. Publius Ovid's Naso, Ovid, wrote with wit, elegance, and daring. His Metamorphoses wove myths into dazzling verse, a treasury of stories that would influence Western literature forever. Yet his Ars Amatoria, the art of love, scandalized Augustus's moral reforms. Its playful instructions on seduction clashed with the emperor's laws promoting family values. In 8 AD, Ovid was exiled to the bleak shores of Tomis on the Black Sea. Officially, Augustus cited a poem and a mistake. The poem was the Ars Amatoria. The mistake, perhaps involvement in scandals within Augustus's own family, remains a mystery. Ovid would die in exile, a reminder that under Augustus, art served politics as much as beauty. The Augustan age also gave Rome its great historian, Titus Livius Livy. His monumental work, Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city, spanned Rome's history from its legendary origins to his own time. Livy wrote of heroes and battles, of virtue and decline. His history was not only a record, but a lesson, showing how Rome's greatness had been earned through discipline, courage, and piety. It reinforced the idea that Augustus's rule was the culmination of Rome's long destiny. Through poetry and history alike, Augustus shaped memory itself. Rome's past, present, and future were bound together in a story that glorified the empire. Yet the most visible transformation of Augustus's reign was written not in words, but in stone. The emperor himself famously declared, "I found Rome a city of brick, I leave it a city of marble." He rebuilt the Forum, erecting the Forum of Augustus with its centerpiece, the Temple of Mars altar, the Avenger, commemorating the defeat of Caesar's assassins. Nearby rose the Era Pacis Augusti, the altar of Augustan peace, dedicated in 9 BC. Its marble reliefs depicted processions of Augustus's family, gods, and symbols of prosperity, celebrating the peace he claimed to have brought to the world. He built the Mausoleum of Augustus on the Campus Martius, a vast tomb for himself and his dynasty, declaring that the house of Augustus would endure forever. Aqueducts carried fresh water into the city. Roads stretched across the provinces. Baths and theaters gave pleasure to the people. Each project bore the mark of Augustus's vision, Rome as eternal. Through these monuments, Augustus's rule became visible in stone. They were not only gifts to the people, but symbols of permanence. Rome was no longer a city of fragile brick. It was the marble capital of empire. The pen and the chisel glorified Augustus as much as the sword. Poetry, history, and monuments proclaimed his reign as the dawn of a golden age. But even as marble monuments rose and poets sang, the question of power remained unsettled. By the middle of his reign, Augustus had reshaped Rome in marble and poetry. The city glowed with temples, forums, and altars that proclaimed peace and victory. Virgil, Horace, and Livy sang of Rome's destiny, binding past and present into a single vision. Over the decades, Augustus carefully accumulated powers and honors, not through sudden seizure, but through gradual gifts bestowed by Senate and people. In this way, he transformed himself from mere ruler into symbol, protector of peace, guardian of tradition, and at last, the father of Rome itself. The first great change had come in 23 BC. That year, Augustus nearly died of illness. Forced to abandon the consulship, which he had held almost every year since 31 BC, he sought another way to maintain authority. The solution was the tribunicia potestas, tribunician powers. Once belonging to the tribunes of the plebs, these powers gave him the right to propose laws, veto decisions, and defend the rights of citizens. They were renewed annually, but in practice, Augustus held them for life. It was a masterstroke. The consulship had marked him as dominant, overshadowing others. But tribunician power seemed humbler, rooted in service to the people. It cloaked supremacy in republican tradition. Augustus could guide legislation, control assemblies, and stand as protector of Rome's citizens, all without the title of dictator or king. This innovation reshaped Rome's constitution. It created a permanent magistracy, wielded by one man alone, that bound political life to Augustus's hand. Quietly, subtly, the Republic had become monarchy in all but name. Yet power was not only legal, it was symbolic, and in these symbols Augustus excelled. In 19 BC, the Senate granted him the right to wear the insignia of a consul, even when he did not hold the office. The purple-bordered toga, the ivory chair, the fasces, these marks of authority could now accompany him at all times. He did not need the title, for the symbols were enough. In the Senate itself, his seat was placed between the two consuls. It was a small gesture, but one heavy with meaning. It declared him neither consul nor king, but something greater, the center of authority, the first among equals. These gestures reinforced the fiction of republican continuity, while ensuring that no one mistook Augustus's true position. Authority radiated from him not only through law, but through ritual and ceremony, through the careful placement of symbols that reminded Rome of who ruled. In 12 BC, another honor came. With the death of Lepidus, Augustus assumed the role of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome. This was no mere title. Religion permeated Roman life. Festivals, sacrifices, omens, all were woven into politics. By holding the highest priesthood, Augustus united sacred and secular power. He became guardian not only of Rome's laws, but of its relationship with the gods. As Pontifex Maximus, Augustus presided over rites, temples, and calendars. His image adorned coins as both emperor and priest. He cast himself as the restorer of Roman tradition, the man who preserved the favor of the divine. Through this role, Augustus claimed legitimacy deeper than politics. He was not only ruler by law, but chosen by destiny, protector of Rome's eternal faith. The final, crowning honor came in 2 BC. After decades of rule, after wars won and peace secured, Augustus was granted the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. It was more than a title. It was a symbol of trust. Augustus was no longer simply a ruler. He was the father of Rome, the protector of its people, the embodiment of its unity. The ceremony was solemn. Senators, magistrates, knights, and even citizens came to honor him. They declared him not king, not dictator, but father, an image of care, stability, and moral guidance. For Augustus, it was the culmination of decades of careful image building. By then, he had ruled longer than most Romans could remember. For the young, there had never been another age but his. His face, his laws, his monuments defined their world. In him, Rome itself was personified. By the dawn of the 1st century AD, Augustus stood as Rome's undisputed father. He was princeps, imperator, pontifex, and pater patriae. Symbols, powers, and honors had fused into something greater than monarchy. By the early years of the 1st century AD, Augustus seemed to embody Rome itself. He was princeps, pontifex maximus, and pater patriae. His authority spanned law, religion, and tradition. To the outside world, the empire appeared eternal, its foundations secure. But behind the marble facade of monuments and honors lay a family torn apart. Death, scandal, and betrayal gnawed at the dynasty Augustus had tried to build. One by one, his heirs fell away, leaving only a single, reluctant figure to inherit the empire. Succession, Augustus's greatest weakness, threatened to undo everything he had created. The tragedies had already begun. In 2 AD, Lucius Caesar, Augustus's younger adopted son, died suddenly in Massilia at only 19. 2 years later, in 4 AD, his elder brother Gaius followed. Wounded on campaign in Armenia, he lingered for months before succumbing at the age of 23. These were not just political losses. They were personal wounds. Augustus had raised Gaius and Lucius as his own sons, parading them before the people as Rome's future. Their deaths within 2 years left him devastated. The dream of a direct Julio-Claudian line collapsed. The empire mourned princes who had never ruled, symbols of promise extinguished too soon. For Augustus, it was more than the loss of heirs. It was the loss of hope, the bitter realization that fate had stripped his dynasty bare. One grandson remained, Agrippa Posthumus, the youngest child of Julia and Marcus Agrippa, born after his father's death in 12 BC. But if Gaius and Lucius were the golden hopes of the empire, Posthumus was their opposite. Sources describe him as violent, reckless, and ill-tempered. Some suggest he lacked the discipline to rule. Augustus tried to shape him, but the boy's nature defied control. He was dangerous, not as a leader, but as a threat. In 6 AD, Augustus made his choice. Agrippa Posthumus was exiled to the island of Planasia, cut off from court, stripped of honors. Officially, it was for misconduct. Unofficially, it ensured he could never disrupt the succession. It was a harsh decision, but necessary. Augustus had seen the chaos civil war could bring. He would not risk Rome's stability for the sake of blood alone. In the shadows of these choices stood Livia Drusilla, Augustus's wife and partner for more than 50 years. Formidable, she shaped the politics of succession as much as Augustus himself. Livia had 2 sons from her first marriage, Tiberius and Drusus. From the beginning, she worked to secure their futures. As the grandsons of Augustus faltered or fell, her influence grew. Tiberius, already a seasoned general, emerged as the only viable heir. Yet suspicion lingered. Ancient historians, hostile to Livia's reputation, whispered that she had hastened the deaths of Gaius and Lucius, clearing the path for her son. Some even claimed she poisoned rivals, maneuvering with ruthless skill. Modern scholars treat these accusations cautiously, recognizing the bias of sources. Still, the rumors remain, casting shadows across her legacy. What cannot be denied is this. Through Livia, the Julio-Claudian dynasty fused with the Claudian house. Augustus's bloodline, weakened and diminished, was bound forever to her sons. And so the reluctant heir emerged. Tiberius, son of Livia, stepson of Augustus. He was no youth, but a man of experience, trained in command. He had campaigned in Germania, secured victories in Pannonia, and crushed rebellions in the Balkans. As a soldier, he was respected, even admired. But Tiberius was not Augustus's chosen heir by affection. He was the heir by necessity. Their relationship was strained, marked by distance rather than warmth. Tiberius himself resented being overlooked for so long, forced to live in the shadow of Gaius and Lucius. In 4 AD, Augustus formally adopted Tiberius as his son. To balance the decision, he also adopted Germanicus, the popular young general beloved by the legions, ensuring that Tiberius would share the future with a figure of charisma and promise. By the final years of his reign, Augustus had lost nearly everyone he hoped would succeed him. Only Tiberius remained. The dynasty Augustus had dreamed of never came to pass. Gaius and Lucius were dead. Agrippa Posthumus was disgraced and exiled. Only Tiberius remained, a reluctant heir shaped more by necessity than love. The empire was vast. Its provinces were administered with order. Its armies held the frontiers. Yet its future was fragile. Augustus, the man who had guided Rome from chaos to empire, was now an old man. And so, in his final years, he faced the inevitable, the end of his own life, and the need to prepare Rome for a world without him. By the early years of the 2nd decade AD, Augustus was more than 70 years old. His body bore the marks of age and illness. Gout, stomach troubles, and fatigue plagued him. His once celebrated energy faded, replaced by frailty. He withdrew often to the island of Capri, and later to the quiet town of Nola in Campania. There, surrounded by gardens and courtyards, he sought relief from the burdens of rule. Yet even in seclusion, he remained emperor. Reports flowed to him. Orders were issued in his name. Policies bore his hand. The image of Rome's eternal father, erect, dignified, invincible, began to waver. Senators and citizens alike saw the truth. Augustus was mortal. The empire's fate would soon pass into other hands. Augustus knew this and made preparations. He ensured that Tiberius was not merely his heir in name, but in power. One by one, he granted him honors, tribunician authority, imperium over the provinces, command of the legions. Tiberius became co-ruler in all but title. Yet Augustus remembered the deaths of heirs past. To safeguard the future, he also elevated Germanicus, the young general beloved by the people and the legions. Germanicus, married to Augustus's granddaughter Agrippina, was meant to secure continuity. Augustus also left counsel for Rome itself. His instructions, recorded by historians, urged moderation. The empire should not chase endless conquest. Its borders, he advised, must follow the natural frontiers: the Rhine, the Danube, the deserts of Africa, and the seas that circled the Mediterranean. Expansion, he warned, could destroy what peace had been built. It was a message from a man who had learned the limits of empire through blood and defeat. In the summer of 14 AD, at his villa in Nola, Augustus's health failed for the last time. On August 19th, he died, aged 75. Livia, his wife of more than 50 years, was by his side. Some ancient sources whispered darkly. They claimed that Livia, eager to secure Tiberius's succession, hastened his end with poison. Modern scholars treat such tales with caution, noting the biases of hostile historians. Most likely, Augustus died of natural causes, worn out by age. His reported final words, passed down by Suetonius, were theatrical, fitting for a man who had shaped his life as carefully as a stage performance. "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit." His body was carried in solemn procession to Rome. Senators, magistrates, and citizens lined the streets. His ashes were placed in the mausoleum of Augustus, the grand tomb he had built decades earlier on the Campus Martius. The dynasty he envisioned was already in turmoil, but the city mourned its founder. With Augustus gone, power passed to Tiberius. The Senate debated, but the outcome was inevitable. Tiberius inherited not only Augustus's titles, but the structure of empire itself. The Julio-Claudian dynasty began its rule. The Senate declared Augustus a god. Temples rose in his honor. Priests tended his cult. For the people of Rome, their emperor had become divine, joining the ranks of the immortals. The Republic was gone forever. In its place stood something new, an empire forged in war, built in marble, sanctified in religion, and destined to endure. Augustus was gone. On August 19, 14 AD, he breathed his last in Nola, leaving behind not only an empire but a system. Power passed to Tiberius without civil war, without bloodshed, without the chaos that had marked the final century of the Republic. Rome did not collapse at the death of its first emperor. Instead, it endured. That endurance was Augustus's greatest achievement. For he had not only conquered lands or built monuments. He had given Rome something far more precious: stability. The world called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. What was the Pax Romana? Historians describe it as nearly 2 centuries of relative internal peace, stretching from Augustus's settlement in 27 BC to the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century AD. It was not a peace without battles. Along the frontiers, legions still clashed with Germans and Britons. Yet within Rome itself, within the empire's heart, the storms of civil war were stilled. The assassinations, the dictatorships, the ceaseless marches of rival generals, all were gone. After a century of violence, Romans could live without fear of soldiers in their streets, without senators plotting daily coups. They could look to tomorrow and expect order. That was the gift of Augustus. Peace allowed prosperity. Trade flourished across the Mediterranean, now a Roman lake. Grain from the fields of Egypt fed the capital. Olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, and marble from Greece poured into Roman markets. Beyond Rome's borders, luxury goods traveled astonishing distances. Silk from distant China, glassware to Persia, spices from the harbors of India. Augustus had prepared the way. Roads linked provinces to capital, stretching thousands of miles across mountains and plains. Bridges spanned rivers once thought uncrossable. Harbors were improved, ports expanded, and shipping lanes protected by the navy. The wealth of empire flowed steadily toward the center. Rome, once a hungry city surviving on uncertain supplies, became a capital of abundance. Farmers prospered, merchants thrived, and the empire's vast machine sustained itself through the rhythm of commerce. Prosperity alone was not enough. Augustus understood the need for stability in society itself. He bound together the classes of Rome and the provinces in ways the Republic had never achieved. The urban poor of Rome, once volatile and easily swayed by demagogues, were steadied by bread and public works. The grain dole ensured that no Roman citizen starved. Amphitheaters and baths, theaters and forums, gave them leisure and pride in their city. Veterans, whose loyalty had once been the plaything of ambitious generals, were resettled in colonies across the provinces. These colonies did more than reward soldiers. They spread Roman culture, language, and law to distant lands, embedding the empire in new soil. In the provinces, Augustus wove local elites into the fabric of rule. Governors relied on native aristocrats to manage cities. In return, those elites gained Roman citizenship, prestige, and access to imperial favor. Diversity was not crushed, it was integrated. Greeks, Gauls, Syrians, and Spaniards all came to see themselves as part of Rome's order. At the empire's heart, Rome itself swelled to more than 1 million souls, the largest city the world had yet seen. Streets bustled with traders, laborers, slaves, senators, and priests. It was noisy, crowded, often dirty, but it was alive, fed and protected by the empire's peace. How different this was from the world Augustus had inherited. The last century of the Republic had been a whirlwind of violence. Assassinations in the Forum, dictatorships that rose and fell, Civil wars that pitted citizen against citizen, legion against legion. Sulla, Marius, Pompey, Caesar, Antony. Each had marched on Rome. Each had drenched its streets in blood. Augustus ended that cycle. He did so at a price. Political freedom withered. The Senate became an ornament, not a ruler. Debate was silenced. Power flowed only through one man. But in exchange, Augustus gave Rome something the Republic could not: stability. When Augustus died in 14 AD, Rome stood at peace. Its provinces were governed with order. Its frontiers were secured. Its people lived under the calm of the Pax Romana. The empire seemed unshakable. But stability rested not only on institutions. It rested on men. Augustus had built a system to endure, yet that system still required leaders to embody it, and leaders rarely matched the founder. The first test came with Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and reluctant heir. He was no stranger to command. As a general, he had shown discipline and brilliance. He subdued tribes in Germania, secured the Balkans, and managed provinces with efficiency. Few doubted his ability. But as emperor, Tiberius was a different figure. In the early years of his reign, he preserved Augustus's settlement. He maintained the empire's frontiers. He respected the Senate's dignity, at least outwardly. His rule was cautious, careful, and above all stable. Yet Tiberius lacked Augustus's charisma. He was aloof, distant, and often bitter. His speeches in the Senate were cold. His relationship with the people was strained. He never sought popularity, nor did he command affection. As the years passed, paranoia took hold. Fear of conspiracies gripped him. Treason trials multiplied. Informers thrived, accusing senators and equestrians of disloyalty. Executions and exiles spread unease. Rome, once united by Augustus's vision, was governed now by suspicion. In 26 AD, Tiberius withdrew from Rome altogether. He retired to the island of Capri, leaving the capital in the hands of Lucius Aelius Sejanus, prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus tightened his grip on power, purging rivals and filling Rome with terror until his downfall in 31 AD. Tiberius reigned until 37 AD, dying at the age of 78. His rule preserved the empire's structure, but it left a bitter taste. Rome had stability but no joy, order but no inspiration. The difference between Augustus and his heir was clear. Augustus had ruled as father. Tiberius ruled as master. When Tiberius died, hope briefly returned. The new emperor was Gaius Caesar, better known to history as Caligula. He was the great-grandson of Augustus, the son of Germanicus, Rome's beloved general. As a child, he had accompanied his father on campaigns, wearing a tiny soldier's uniform. The troops had nicknamed him Caligula, Little Boot. At first, his reign shone with promise. The people rejoiced. The Senate cheered. He granted amnesties, ended treason trials, and gave lavish games. Rome believed that Augustus's blood had returned to bring back the Golden Age. But the dream soured. Ancient historians claim that after an illness in late 37 AD, Caligula's behavior changed. Extravagance, cruelty, and bizarre whims replaced generosity. He squandered the treasury on spectacles. He humiliated senators, forcing them to run beside his chariot or grovel in public. Stories spread of madness, that he planned to make his horse, Incitatus, a consul, that he marched legions to the shore and commanded them to collect seashells as spoils of war, that he proclaimed himself a living god and demanded worship. Some of these tales may be exaggerations, products of hostile sources. Yet they reflect a truth. Caligula's reign was marked by instability and fear. After only 4 years, in 41 AD, his own guards struck him down. The Praetorians, once Augustus's shield, became executioners. Caligula's body was left in the palace, proof that even emperors were not safe from the blades of their protectors. Succession was fragile, based not on law but on family. Adoption, marriages, and untimely deaths shaped the fate of emperors. The empire itself survived Tiberius's suspicion and Caligula's cruelty. Yet each reign revealed how much depended on the character of the man who ruled. Augustus had promised stability. His heirs delivered uncertainty. In the end, Augustus was the architect. Tiberius and Caligula lived within the house he built, but they could not expand or improve it. One preserved stability without vision. The other squandered it in madness. And so Rome learned the truth. The empire Augustus left was strong, but its fate would always rest on the nature of its emperors. Augustus's successors struggled to match his legacy. Tiberius had left a legacy of suspicion and fear. Caligula had followed with chaos and assassination. Twice already, the empire Augustus founded had been tested by flawed heirs. Yet the Julio-Claudian dynasty did not end there. The house of Augustus staggered onward, first under Claudius, then under Nero. Together they revealed the resilience of Augustus's system and the fragility of the dynasty that bore his name. In 41 AD, after Caligula's murder, chaos filled the palace. Senators debated abolishing the Principate. Soldiers scoured the halls. And in a corner, trembling behind a curtain, they found Claudius, the uncle of Caligula, great-nephew of Augustus. Few had ever thought him destined to rule. Born in 10 BC, Claudius had suffered from ill health. He walked with a limp, stammered when he spoke, and was mocked by his family as a fool. For years he was kept from public office, seen as unfit for the burdens of power. Yet when the Praetorian Guard discovered him, they proclaimed him emperor. The Senate, reluctant but powerless, confirmed their choice. The empire had a new ruler, one no one had expected. And to Rome's surprise, Claudius proved capable. He reorganized government, expanding the role of freedmen as imperial administrators. He presided carefully over judicial cases, giving access to justice for many who had been ignored. He undertook ambitious building projects, including aqueducts that brought fresh water to the capital. Most famously, in 43 AD, Claudius launched the conquest of Britain. Legions crossed the Channel, subdued tribes, and founded the colony of Camulodunum, modern Colchester. Britain would remain a Roman province for centuries, its conquest one of Claudius's greatest achievements. But his reign was also marred by intrigue. Wives and freedmen wielded immense influence. His third wife, Messalina, was executed for alleged plots and infidelity. His fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, niece of Caligula and mother of Nero, became even more powerful. Ancient sources claim it was she who poisoned Claudius in 54 AD, ensuring her son's succession. Claudius, the man once dismissed as weak, had ruled for 13 years. He had expanded the empire, strengthened its administration, and shown that even unlikely rulers could succeed. But he left behind an heir whose reign would mark the dynasty's darkest hour. In 54 AD, Nero ascended the throne at the age of 16. Son of Agrippina, adopted by Claudius, he was the great-great-grandson of Augustus. His youth and lineage gave hope. At first, his reign seemed promising. Guided by his mother Agrippina, the philosopher Seneca, and the general Burrus, Nero's early years brought moderation and reform. Taxes were lightened. Justice was tempered with mercy. The people rejoiced. But soon the promise gave way to horror. Nero chafed under his mother's control. In 59 AD, he ordered her murder. Ancient accounts describe the failed attempt to drown her in a collapsing boat, followed by soldiers sent to finish the deed. With Agrippina's death, Nero was freed from restraint, and his tyranny began. He indulged in extravagance, bankrupting the treasury with games, palaces, and spectacles. He persecuted rivals, ordering executions and forcing senators to suicide. He pursued the arts, performing on stage and competing in chariot races, shocking Romans who expected dignity from their emperor. In 64 AD, disaster struck. A great fire swept through Rome, destroying much of the city. Rumors spread that Nero himself had sung or played music while the city burned. Ancient historians preserve the story, though many doubt its truth. What is certain is that Nero seized the devastation as an opportunity to build his golden house, a palace of staggering luxury. To deflect blame, he turned fury upon a small sect, the Christians. Their persecution under Nero marked the beginning of their long struggle with Rome, remembered for its brutality. By the late 60s, revolts spread across the empire. Galba in Spain, Vindex in Gaul, and others rose against him. In 68 AD, the Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. Deserted and alone, he fled the city. On June 9, 68 AD, at the age of 30, Nero ended his own life. His reported last words were, "What an artist dies in me." With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended. Nero's suicide in 68 AD left the throne empty. Augustus's bloodline, carried through adoption and marriage, was extinguished. Civil war returned. In 69 AD, the year of the four emperors, and finally Vespasian vied for power. Rome, once again, was torn by rival claimants. The irony was clear. Augustus had created stability. His dynasty had preserved it for a time. Yet in the end, the house of Augustus collapsed in blood and fire. The system endured. The family did not. The Julio-Claudians left a mixed inheritance. Claudius had shown that even flawed men could govern well, expanding the empire and strengthening its institutions. Nero had shown how quickly power could be squandered, how fragile legitimacy became without Augustus's vision and discipline. The empire survived them both. It survived Tiberius's suspicion, Caligula's madness, Claudius's intrigues, and Nero's destruction. That survival itself was a testament to Augustus. He had built not just a dynasty, but a system strong enough to outlast the failings of his heirs. The dynasty of Augustus had ended in fire and blood, yet the empire he built endured. The Julio-Claudian dynasty ended in chaos. Nero died in 68 AD, the last of Augustus's bloodline. Civil war erupted in the year of the four emperors. Legions fought each other for power. Provinces rose in rebellion. Rome seemed on the brink of collapse. And yet, the empire endured. Why? Because Augustus had built more than a dynasty. He had built a system, a structure of power and administration that survived the fall of his family. Long after his death, Augustus remained the measure of empire. Every ruler who followed, whether soldier, philosopher, or tyrant, was judged against his shadow. Order was restored by Vespasian, who reigned from 69 to 79 AD. A soldier of humble origin, he brought discipline back to the empire. Practical, he rebuilt Rome's finances after the extravagance of Nero. Vespasian began construction of the Colosseum, the great amphitheater that still stands today. It was a gift to the people, built on the site of Nero's palace, a deliberate contrast. He presented himself as a restorer, not a tyrant, following Augustus's model of stability and service. His sons, Titus and Domitian, continued his legacy. Titus ruled briefly, remembered for compassion during disasters, the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, and a great fire in Rome. Domitian, harsher and more autocratic, provoked fear but preserved order. Together, the Flavians rebuilt the empire after civil war, invoking Augustus as their guide. His example remained the standard for legitimacy. In the 2nd century AD, the empire entered what later generations called its golden age. A line of rulers known as the Five Good Emperors reigned through adoption rather than bloodline: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. They governed from 96 to 180 AD, and each in his own way looked back to Augustus. Trajan, who reigned from 98 to 117 AD, carried Rome to its greatest territorial extent. His conquests in Dacia and the East swelled the empire with wealth. The Senate hailed him with the phrase, Optimus Princeps, the best ruler, even better than Augustus. Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 AD, chose another path. He abandoned conquests that could not be sustained and instead consolidated Rome's borders. He built fortifications, the most famous being Hadrian's Wall in Britain. His policies echoed Augustus's dying counsel: do not overreach, secure what you hold. Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius continued this tradition, governing with justice and restraint. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, fought wars on the Danube while meditating on duty, writing words that still endure. Each of these rulers embodied the Augustan model: peace, prosperity, stability. They expanded when safe, held back when wise, and ruled as guardians rather than tyrants. Augustus's ghost guided them still. Even in death, Augustus was everywhere. Deified by the Senate, he was worshipped across the empire. Temples rose in his honor. Priests tended his cult. In distant provinces, offerings were made to his divine spirit. His statues adorned forums and villas. His profile appeared on coins. His monuments, from the era Paces to his mausoleum, reminded Romans daily of the man who had ended civil war and brought peace. Later emperors sought to cloak themselves in his image. They called themselves New Augustuses. They restored temples in his name. They claimed his mantle to legitimize their own power. For centuries, to be an emperor of Rome was to live in the shadow of Augustus. Augustus's empire endured for 500 years in the west, and 1,000 more in the east as Byzantium. His settlement, monarchy disguised as republicanism, shaped Roman politics for generations. His blending of power and tradition became the template for empire itself. He ended the republic, but in doing so, he created the empire that defined Western history. From Vespasian to Trajan, from Hadrian to Marcus Aurelius, every emperor lived in Augustus's shadow. In the autumn of 63 BC, a child was born in the small town of Velletri. His name was Gaius Octavius. Few could have imagined that this boy, of modest background, would one day rule the known world. Through cunning, fortune, and relentless ambition, Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. He survived the assassins of Caesar, outmaneuvered rivals like Antony, and defeated enemies from Philippi to Actium. He reshaped Rome's institutions, reformed its city, secured its provinces, and left behind a system that endured for centuries. From a fragile republic torn by civil war, he created an empire of order and peace. From a youth dismissed as weak, he became master of the Mediterranean. From a man born mortal, he became a god in Roman memory. And so we arrive at the central question: who is Augustus? Was he Rome's savior, or the destroyer of its republic? To some, Augustus was a tyrant in all but name. The republic had stood for centuries, built on shared power between senate, magistrates, and assemblies. Augustus ended it. He concentrated authority in his own hands. He commanded the armies, the treasury, and the priesthoods. He wore the mask of tradition, calling himself Princeps, the first citizen. Yet beneath that mask, all real power was his. His rise was paved with violence. Proscriptions in 43 BC filled Rome with blood, cutting down senators and equestrians. Civil wars claimed tens of thousands of lives. Antony, Cleopatra, Brutus, Cassius, all rivals eliminated one by one. Augustus also mastered propaganda. He filled Rome with monuments proclaiming his peace, poets who sang of his destiny, and coins that spread his image across the empire. Opposition was silenced. Ancient critics saw through the illusion. Tacitus, writing a century later, declared that under Augustus, liberty had been lost. The republic had been enslaved. To such voices, Augustus was a manipulator, a tyrant who cloaked monarchy in the robes of freedom. Yet another truth cannot be ignored. Before Augustus, Rome was tearing itself apart. The last century of the republic was marked by chaos: Marius and Sulla, Pompey and Caesar, civil wars that bled Rome dry. Assassinations stained the forum. Armies marched not against enemies, but against fellow citizens. Augustus ended the cycle. He restored order. He created a system that worked. He reformed taxation, built roads, established postal relays. He gave Rome its first fire service and police force, the vigiles. He reshaped the administration of provinces, ensuring stability from Spain to Syria. He presided over a cultural golden age. Virgil composed the Aeneid, linking Rome's destiny to the will of the gods. Horace wrote of peace and civic virtue. Livy chronicled Rome's history, reminding citizens of their greatness. Most of all, Augustus began the Pax Romana, 2 centuries of relative peace and prosperity. Trade flourished across the Mediterranean. Rome became the largest city the world had ever seen. Farmers, merchants, and craftsmen thrived under the security of empire. In this light, Augustus was not a tyrant but a savior, the man who delivered Rome from civil war and gave it centuries of stability. Perhaps the truth lies between these two visions. Augustus was both destroyer and creator, tyrant and savior. His wars claimed countless lives. His rise required ruthless ambition. The republic of Cicero and Cato, of free debate and shared power, was extinguished. And yet, what followed was not collapse but endurance. His system of power lasted 500 years in the West and 1,000 in the East. The empire he founded defined Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Even today, its roads, laws, and monuments shape the world. Augustus embodied Rome's contradictions. He was ruthless, yet patient, cold, yet visionary, manipulative, yet capable of genuine statesmanship. He killed the Republic, but he built something stronger. On August 19, 14 AD, Augustus died in Nola, at the age of 75. His final words, according to Suetonius, were theatrical. "Have I played my part well? Then applaud as I exit." For 2,000 years, history has debated whether he deserved applause or condemnation. Was he a tyrant who enslaved a free republic? Or was he a savior who rescued Rome from itself? The answer may be that he was both. A man who ended liberty but gave stability. A man who waged ruthless wars but left behind enduring peace. A man whose ambition knew no bounds, yet whose vision shaped the ancient world. 2,000 years later, Augustus remains both a tyrant and a savior, the man who ended the republic and the man who built an empire.